Hi, I'm Kate Rigby. I'm the director of Bath Spa's Research Centre for Environmental Humanities and also adjunct professor at Monash University in Australia. And the title of my paper is Remember Kinglake, for reasons which will become apparent in due course. So in this talk, I want to broaden our considerations of the social justice dimensions of climatic and environmental change to a multi-species perspective. And in particular, I'm going to focus on disaster mitigation in an anthropogenically warming world, which I argue is necessarily a trans-species project. So the first part of my argument is that effective disaster mitigation begins with the recognition that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Taking shape from the mid-18th century, but entering the English lexicon only towards the end of the 19th century, this term arises from what Michel Serres has termed the modern constitution that became embedded in the institutionalization of knowledge production during the 19th century, engendering the severance of the natural from the human sciences that the environmental humanities has set out to mend. This dualistic onto-epistemology took shape and struck root at precisely the time when science and technology were enrolling ever more non-human entities into the complex networks that are constitutive of industrial societies. Along with the things that most of us value, such as refrigerators and motorcars, this process has unintentionally generated various seriously undesirable natural cultural hybrids, as Latour calls them, such as ozone depletion and, of course, climate change. Meanwhile, coming to terms with these hybrid phenomena, which can only be understood and redressed through a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary lens, has been made all the more difficult because of the great divide between the sciences and the humanities, along with the marginalization of alternative knowledge systems, for example, those of colonized peoples. Similarly, the crucial task of recognizing and addressing the multiple human and non-human agencies and processes that go into the making of disasters arising from the calamitous conjunction of particular geophysical and sociocultural phenomena has been hindered by the modern notion of natural disaster. So, ironically, the very period when long-term human impacts upon the planet have escalated to such an extent that our era has been dubbed the Anthropocene, is also the era in which the entanglement of morality and materiality, social relations and natural phenomena has become veiled. As anthropologists of disaster, Susanna Hoffman and Anthony Oliver Smith have observed, disasters spring from the nexus where environment, society, and technology come together, the point where place, people, and human construction of both the material and non-material meet. It is from the interplay of these three planes that disasters emanate, and in their unfolding, they re-implicate every vector of their causal interface. Typically framed as events, disasters are better understood as material discursive processes, in which the varying needs and interests of the individuals, groups, and organizations affected are articulated and negotiated over the often extended duration of the entire phenomenon. Occurring in the context of longer-term processes of socio-ecological development or maldevelopment, even those calamities that are triggered by entirely non-anthropogenic phenomena, such as earthquakes or volcanoes, frequently participate in the inequitable distribution of environmental harms that Rob Nixon has termed slow violence. No such disaster, then, is ever purely natural, but always to a greater or lesser extent socio-ecological. As such, they're better described as eco-catastrophes. Disasters of this kind are also always apocalyptic in the original Greek meaning of this term, that is to say, they reveal something important about the interrelationship of environment, society, and technology in a given place and time. But what they are seen to reveal, indeed whether their revelatory character is recognized at all, depends on the cultural lenses and discursive frames through which they are viewed. This is why the term natural disaster is so disastrous. By implying that disaster descends from outside the social realm, from something over yonder called nature, It obscures human responsibility for creating the conditions under which a given geophysical extreme becomes calamitous for a particular population. In so doing, it militates against the recognition of the potential for human agency in disaster preparation and mitigation. In addition, since other than human beings, especially non-domesticated ones, are generally lumped into the category of nature, which functions in this coinage as the agent of disaster, their status as potential victims is veiled. Instead of recognizing how disasters disclose variously configured vulnerabilities to geophysical extremes across species lines, it seems that it is we, innocent humans, who are being set upon by a violent and amoral nature over yonder. In the era of anthropogenic climate change, moreover, the continued framing of weather-borne extremes as natural disasters becomes particularly maladaptive. For example, in the summer of 2012-2013, Australia experienced a whole series of weather extremes, breaking 123 weather records in 90 days. It got so hot in the centre of Australia that the Weather Bureau had to actually create a new colour for their meteorological charts. And this was dubbed the Angry Summer by Australia's Climate Council. But in the midst of this, our Prime Minister, while she was responding to floods in Queensland while comforting the victims of bushfire in Victoria, declared that the whole country was being challenged by nature, but that we are a strong and smart nation and we'll get through this, she said, as we always do, by pulling together. Well, here Gillard taps into a specifically Australian variant of nature-culture dualism, the settler stereotype of the matey Aussie battler, struggling to make a life for himself in a land of promise but beset by droughts, fires, floods, poor soils, foot rot, and sundry plant and animal pests, most of them exotic. Gillard's reassurance suggests that it is once more us Aussie battlers holding out against the unruly elements, and it is our exclusively human mateship and superior smarts that will get us through it. As well as fostering that underlying contempt, fear, and even hatred towards the natural environment, the colonial earth, which Simon Estock has termed ecophobia, this response militates against the recognition of these extremes as something other than what settler Australians have experienced in the past, namely as at least partially anthropogenic, and hence as sentinel events, in which we should be discerning the wrongs of our current modus vivendi, a foreboding of worse to come, and an urgent call to change our ways. In fact, the really scary thing about this is that the subsequent summers broke more records. So this kind of run of meteorological record breaking has continued in Australia, as indeed it has elsewhere. So what I want to focus in on here is a particular disaster that occurred in Victoria in 2009. It became known as the Black Saturday firestorm. On February the 7th, at the height of a decade-long drought and in the midst of an absolutely unprecedented heat wave, several of the 400 fires burning across Victoria converged, obliterating 6 small towns and badly damaging many more, taking 173 human lives and displacing over 7,500 survivors, as well as burning out over 450,000 hectares of land, killing 2,150 sheep, 1,207 cattle, an unknown number of horses, goats, alpacas, poultry and pigs, along with countless wild animals. Australia's worst bushfire disaster to date was also noteworthy for the fiery debates that followed regarding its causes and significance. For example, eminent environmental philosopher Freya Matthews, amplifying the assessment of a number of climatologists regarding the heatwave that precipitated the blaze, published an opinion piece in Melbourne's Age newspaper, in which she maintained that the fires we saw on Saturday were not once in 1,000 years or even once in 100 years events, as our political leaders kept repeating. They were the face of climate change in our part of the world. Matthews was subject to a torrent of abuse by climate change denialists, while Australia's only national newspaper, the Murdoch-owned Australian, led a concerted campaign to undermine any link with climate change, targeting instead those environmentalists who had allegedly prevented the widespread prescribed burning, which it was questionably claimed would have stopped the fires from becoming so ferocious. Miranda Devine took this fight against eco-terrorism, as she called it, to the Sydney Morning Herald, where she insisted it is not arsonists who should be hanging from lampposts, but greenies. Well, equally troubling, if less explicitly homicidal, are responses such as that of the survivors of the firestorm that obliterated the township of Marysville. At a meeting to plan their first trip back to their burnt-out township, where police were still sifting through the ash for human remains, the displaced residents declared their intention to stand together and loudly reclaim Marysville from nature. This defiant stance not only exemplifies once more the ecophobic conclusion that has been drawn from the experience of a disaster tagged as natural, it also indicates that such defiance could lead survivors to put themselves in harm's way by seeking to restore what had been lost, rather than finding new ways and potentially new places to live more safely and sustainably as we move ineluctably into a climatically changed future. Moreover, this maladaptive stance betrays a woeful level of settler Australian ignorance and amnesia regarding the pyrophytic ways of the bush that they value, if at all, either as an economic or aesthetic resource, that is, as scenery, a passive background for human endeavours rather than a dynamic network of volatile forces and other than human interests. And I should say at the moment that I am Australian, so this critique is self-referential. As environmental historian Tom Griffiths, author of the landmark environmental history of Victoria's mountain ash forests, observed at the time, and as Christine Hansen has reiterated in an article that's just appeared, while the severity of the conditions in which the fires took hold had an anthropogenic index, this was, in fact, a fertility dance that had its origins in the remnant Gondwanic forests of old Australia, one that's taken place at least every 300 to 400 years in the mountain ash forests of southeastern Victoria for millennia. For mountain ash, which, unlike other eucalypts, are killed by these mega blazes, also require them to reproduce and have evolved to take advantage of the long, hot, dry periods combined with particular wind patterns that inevitably bring bushfires of varying intensity to this part of Australia on a regular basis. But settler Australian historical memory, such as it is, goes back less than 200 years in this region, while the historical memory of those who had developed a fine-grained understanding of the Victorian lands, known as country in Aboriginal English, that they had helped to shape. This memory has been all but obliterated by the depredations of colonisation, which were particularly severe in Victoria. Moreover, the associated environmental changes wrought by colonisation, the replacement of Indigenous fire stick farming or igniculture by forestry, grazing and agriculture, appear to have increased the frequency of the firestorms that now threaten a growing population on and beyond the sprawling edges of Australia's second largest metropolis, Melbourne. Current endeavours to recover Aboriginal burning practices as a tool for bushfire mitigation, which fail to confront the violent history of colonisation and which disregard the local specifics, along with the environmental ethics of Indigenous land management, risk perpetuating settler Australian hubris and lack of intimacy with country, as Christine Hansen has argued. As Stephen Mukey has observed, the stories told about natural disasters are crucial in the organisation of people's responses in the medium to long term. While the stories of individual events are told in the detail, they're nonetheless already broadly scripted by narrative forms of mythical strength. And this is really the sort of underpinning of my last book, Dancing with Disaster: Environmental Histories, Narratives and Ethics for Perilous Times. According to Hansen, Aboriginal dreaming stories concerning firestorms in the forested mountains ringing Melbourne have in fact survived the carnage of colonisation, and we would do well to attend to them. But meanwhile, some non-Indigenous Australians too are tapping into their cultural archive in search of narrative and poetic potentials for reimagining those disasters misleadingly framed as natural, and discerning the socio-ecological messages, at once material and moral, that they bring. One such is Melbourne poet Geordie Albiston, who returned to the Hebrew book of Lamentations, written in response to the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BCE, and attributed to the prophet Jeremiah. While this authorial ascription is now thought by biblical scholars to be incorrect, the placement of the biblical Lamentations directly after the book of Jeremiah frames it in such a way as to lend a prophetic dimension to this series of songs. Jeremiah was profoundly critical of his own society, as were, of course, all the Hebrew prophets, targeting in particular the treacherous trading practices that had allowed the ruling elite to grow, quote, great and rich, fat and sleek at others' expense, while failing to protect the cause of the orphan and defend the rights of the needy. In addition, Jeremiah bewails their indifference to the drying up of the land, troped as mourning, and the disappearance of birds and animals, alluding to a regional environmental crisis that he also associates with wrongdoing. They made it a desolation, cries the Lord through the voice of the prophet. Desolate it mourns to me. The whole land is made desolate, but no one lays it to heart. Read in conjunction with Jeremiah's searing socio-ecologic critique, then, the succeeding songs of sorrow for the destruction of Jerusalem become linked with the grief-stricken awareness of the particular ills that beset the city prior to the Babylonian invasion, which thereby acquires the force of a sentinel event. So this is what Geordie Albiston returns to these Lamentations of Jeremiah in order to respond to the devastation of one small town, Kinglake, with which she actually had a connection. She lived there for some time. So in her contemporary lament for the destruction of Kinglake and the devastation of the surrounding bushland, Albiston follows the Hebrew original of the first four poems of the Lamentations in composing her verses as alphabetical acrostics, stopping each time at the letter V, V that is for Victoria, at the conclusion of the first three poems in the sequence, and for vanquished in the last. The incompletion of this alphabetic acrostic invokes that of the Hebrew original, which has only 22 letters, but it can also be read as an acknowledgement of the inability of words to convey the full horror of this event. Crucially, Albiston also replicates the reversal of the letters P and Q in poems 2, 3, and 4 to indicate that all is not right. Echoing other formal features of the 1611 authorised version of the English translation, such as a seemingly arbitrary use of italics, actually marking words supplied by the translators for grammatical purposes, the sense of local detail and general desolation as expressed through specific imagery, the music of rhythm and repetition, and a formal register of communal grief, Albiston nonetheless departs from the biblical Lamentations in certain key ways. Firstly, by carefully excluding any suggestion of divine vengeance. Black Saturday is not cast as an instance of divine intervention. But secondly, by emphatically including diverse non-human others among the innocent victims of the firestorm. So this poem was first published in an earlier version in the online journal Eureka Street in 2011 under the title Kinglake Undone, and then published in a revised edition in her work, 12 Poems of 2013. I've also written on this in my contribution to Adamson and Davies' collection, Humanities for the Environment. And I'm just going to read a few sections from this long poem and comment on how this helps us to kind of reimagine Black Saturday as something other than a purely natural disaster. So this is how it begins. Ah, look how the township sits solitary, that was so full of people. Look how she sits like a weeping widow, the town that just yesterday sat queen of Murrindindi and of the great dividing range, that sat jewel in the crown of all Melbourne. Black is the only one here. Black is the only one left. Whichever way we turn, it is black who meets our eye, black who shakes our hand, black who murmurs nothing in our ear. Can you believe it? Do you believe what you see? Everything is missing now. There is no movement in the bush. Everything is gone, and there is no bush. Flora, fauna, family, gone. How has it come to this? While the poem does not provide a definitive answer to this question, the speaker alludes to a number of actors and factors, both human and otherwise, that contributed to the catastrophe. So leaping forward to the third poem in the sequence, we read that we are to understand the story of firestorm and flame, of north wind and southerly change, understand the story of drought and of fuel, understand and understand and understand again. In an anthropogenically warming world, to understand the story of drought and fuel is to recognize not only the necessity for preventive burning to reduce the fuel that fans the flames on days such as this, it is also to acknowledge that the day trippers described earlier in the poem, among those whose carbon dioxide emissions, the fuel that powers their cars and so much else in their lives, have inadvertently contributed to the unprecedented heat wave that created the conditions in which this firestorm took hold. Going back to the second stanza, which is the immediately precedes the firestorm, we read, "Ah, today you are bringing your baskets to Kinglake. Bread and meat are in your baskets. You are bringing them to Jehoshaphat Valley and to Mason's Falls and to Kinglake National Park. Children are in your cars. You are bringing them with your biscuits to picnic in Kinglake. Driving up the mountain, you stop to snap shots of flowers and of the forest and of Strathewen far below, and of Melbourne farther below that is covered with cloud in its heat. Each leaf is shining as if it were of a garden, each leaf of each tree within each of the habitations along the road that you are driving with your baskets and children all the way to the place of Kinglake." Valuing nature aesthetically, while failing to register the disruptive impact of their fossil-fueled lifestyle, such privileged day trippers are ironically hastening the devastation of those very places that they like to visit recreationally on sunny Sundays. Moreover, they're so kind of out of touch with the messages they should be reading in the land, the cloud of heat over Melbourne, that they've brought their children into grave danger. And this devastation, Albiston stresses, calls us into what Deborah Bird Rose has called a moral community with more than human others. And so, going back to the third stanza, we are asked to pray for Kinglake, pray for the bush and the paddock and the town, pray for the sky and the ground, pray for the possum, the ringtail and brushtail, for the koala and the grey kangaroo. Remember to pray for the spider and the skink, the goanna, the gecko, the pink galah. Remember the rosella, remember the snake, the heifer, the horse, and the brown speckled hen. Remember to pray for Kinglake, and once again to understand the story of firestorm and flame, of north wind and southerly change, to understand the story of drought and of fuel, to understand and understand and understand again. And this poem ends, not the whole thing, but the third part of it. Victoria is altered, Victoria is burnt, Victoria is not, cannot be the same. Well, echoing the prophetic witness of Jeremiah, Albertson's Lamentations not only performs the work of mourning, it also carries an ominous note of warning. In this way, as well as by inviting the reader to enter imaginatively into the collective suffering of those affected, human and otherwise, the literature of disaster can help to reframe such calamities as wake-up calls, disclosing the potential for worse to come and thereby encouraging preventative, which is to say socio-ecologically transformative action. Literary and other works of the creative imagination can also engender greater mental preparedness for the shocks that are proliferating around the planet, fostering endeavours to reduce vulnerability, enhance resilience, seek justice and practice compassion in the increasingly calamitous and problematically named Anthropocene. The question is, who is listening? As I've read, Victoria is said to not be the same, and yet, disastrously, by 2016, real estate prices for properties caught in the worst of the firestorm had not only fully recovered but surpassed the pre-fire prices of 2009 as the bush regreened and the ash sank into the soil, as Christine Hansen points out. As the climate warms and the pieces fall into place for another conflagration, Australian settler society persists in its perilous insouciance to its true socio-ecological situation, blithely ignoring the warning calls of scientists, historians, Aboriginal elders, and poets. Thank you.